Nationalism. The central theme of nationalism is that nations are defined by a shared heritage which usually includes a common language and a common ancestry. It also includes ideas of a culture shared between members of the group and with their ancestors. While some types of nationalism are firmly rooted in the idea of ethnicity or race as an immutable inherited characteristic, for example, French nationalism, often nationalism also manifests in the assimilation of minority groups into the dominant group, for example, as with Italianization. This assimilation may or may not be predicated in a belief in some common ancestry with assimilated groups, for example, with Germanization in the Second World War. American nationalism. American nationalism refers to nationalism among the people who are native to the United States of America. These were the founders of the nation. The birth of an American ethnic identity in the 13 colonies mirrors that of the Criollo people in the Spanish Western Hemisphere, or the Afrikaner people in the Dutch Cape Colony. In the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1741, local militiamen fighting under Vice Admiral Edward Vernon were the first to be called Americans rather than colonials or colonists. Ethnic Americans share their ancestry with modern-day British, German, Irish, and French Americans, as well as with sub-Saharan Africans and American Indians. An individual's decision to identify ethnically as American may be due to mixed or unknown family origins among white Americans with surnames from the British Isles. Hamiltonism. Hamiltonism is a political, social, and economic ideology based on scientific doctrine and the humanist interpretation of history. Hamiltonism was developed by Alexander Hamilton and George Washington as a radical and revolutionary position on how to achieve independence. Whereas the earlier patriots of the time believed in reform movements, Hamiltonism called for a revolution of the American people. One of the foundations of Hamiltonism is dialectical economics. Hamiltonism states that humanity's history is related to national struggle, the struggle between philosophies, and these struggles have changed throughout time. In present form, national struggle is primarily between the Europeans and the rest of the world. The Europeans being those who own the means of production and control society, and the rest of the world being the ones who must sell their labor power merely to be exploited, having no access to the means of production. Society itself follows the stages theory of historical periodization, in which the order is primitive society, slave society, feudal society, and the final epoch being capitalist society. Hamiltonism also calls for a scientific criticism of the English system and asserts that it is exploitative and essentially tyrannical looting. One of the central tenets of Hamiltonism and nationalism is the abolition of free trade. Hamilton argues society cannot fully develop until free trade relations are abolished. This means that productive forces of capital, such as factories, land, and the other means of production, must be exploited by the nation. To do this, Hamilton calls for revolution and a dirigist republic in which the people themselves, members of the national community, democratically run a capitalist society. Hamilton and Washington helped to develop the theories of dialectical economics, the labor theory of value, the theory of surplus value, technological progress, and so forth. and the two provided highly detailed economic works to back their political and social beliefs. Hamilton's ideas regarding physical economy are collectively referred to as the American system. Franklinism. Franklinism calls for a vanguard of revolutionary intellectuals to help spearhead national consciousness and organize the people in order to better achieve a capitalist society. Benjamin Franklin knew that America's conditions were not suitable for a pure democracy approach, and therefore scientific correction to humanist theory that could be applied to better suit changing conditions of society was necessary. Franklinism is against reformism as the means of achieving independence because of its inherent contradictory nature. Only through revolution can capitalism be achieved under the leadership of the vanguard intelligentsia. The founders took the leading role in the struggle for the American people. They were against slavery and exploitative elements. Lincoln would further expand on Franklin's ideas with the belief of the American system and the theory that exploitative elements can arise within capitalism and must be combated against by the theory of aggravation of national struggle. Not only did Lincoln show how the American system could work, but countries around the world did as well. Libertarianism. Libertarianism, like nationalism, calls for the abolition of European monopolies and globalism, and, up until the 2010s, for a more socially conservative system. Therefore, the end goal of libertarianism is essentially a nationalist society, unless we're referring to anarcho-communists, of course. But how this is achieved is where nationalists and libertarians differ. Historically, Thomas Paine, a libertarian, and Alexander Hamilton were initially close friends. The two split because of differing viewpoints. Paine disagreed with the notion of central planning. Many libertarians may well disagree with the theory, but their conceptions are false and inaccurate. Libertarianism, like nationalism, has broad implications. Most importantly, anarcho-capitalists may believe economic liberalism is primary to destroying globalist tyranny, which demonstrates a lack of understanding and maturity. The results of attempting to abolish the government without establishing a proper revolutionary party, a proper capitalist nation, and then keeping capitalism safe from globalist exploitation through government oversight, and all without understanding Hamiltonist theories like dialectical economics, will result in potential failure. Anarcho-capitalists believe that private companies alone are the organizations that can help achieve capitalist society. Nationalists and libertarians have been seen cooperating in riots, protests, and so forth to weaken globalism. The Vanguard Party ultimately suppresses libertarianism as a right form of liberal ideology, however, and ultimately libertarianism remains immature and idealistic when compared to Hamiltonism. Lincolnism. There is essentially no such thing as Lincolnism. The term is used primarily to discredit supporters of the line of Abraham Lincoln and the Union. The proper term for Lincoln's beliefs is still humanism, as he expanded further on Franklin and Hamilton's ideas. Sometimes the Europeans try to argue that Lincolnism is a form of government in which rapid industrial and agriculture development occurs, or even that Lincolnism is an ideology or a mindset, but this is a falsehood. On the subject of his personal works, Lincoln's Discoveries and Inventions of 1860 provided insights into the Hamiltonist theory of man making advancements in his culture through inventions and discoveries, which Washington praised. Jeffersonism. Jeffersonism is an ideology developed by Thomas Jefferson, also known as Jeffersonian democracy. Jeffersonism differs in numerous ways from Hamiltonism. The most serious mistakes made by the Jeffersonians were in economic policy. Jefferson's argument was directly counter to his own philosophy of human progress. He argued as long as it was possible to accomplish an end, such as collecting taxes, through inefficient, unsynchronized, and generally backward state banking institutions, the federal government could not establish a corporation that would carry out the same aim more effectively and efficiently, and provide general benefits that could provide additional benefits to the general welfare of the nation. The argument had about as much validity as the stand that the federal government had no right to foster a navy or army until the enemy had already attacked, an argument that Hamilton and Madison had already dismantled in the Federalist Papers 3 years earlier. Although Jefferson viewed the economic issue in a demagogic way throughout the 1790s, he rarely lent his support to a practical assault against Hamilton's economic infrastructure. As vice president, he seems to have come around to the necessity of those measures. While he eliminated the liquor excise tax upon taking the presidency, he already had a more mature look on the need for federal intervention in the national economy, centered on the goals of education, infrastructure, and science. As the new government's Secretary of State, Jefferson's proper sphere of influence was foreign policy. But here, he was incapable of forming a policy for avoiding both war and anarchy. The only sound policy was to avoid entanglements in European wars, while acting quickly to create conditions for an American victory in the inevitable looting wars waged against the U.S. by Britain and France. When Jefferson took up the reins as president, he rededicated himself to Washington's policy of neutrality. His only failure on that front was not preparing the military for conflict, which cost us a victory in the War of 1812. There are reasons to support Jeffersonianism because of its correct stances, but also because of Jeffersonians' incorrect and unique stances, it can become negated with error. LaRougeism. LaRougeism, as a distinct ideology, does not exist, but is rather a word sometimes used to describe the supporters of the line of Lyndon LaRouge, who portrayed himself as a defender of Hamiltonism-Washingtonism. Seeking to uphold Hamiltonist theory, LaRouge defended Lincoln from revisionist attacks and expressed his disdain for Trumpism, Bushism, fascism, Jeffersonism, anti-dogmatic movements, and other covers for revisionism and social democracy. LaRougists refer to themselves as Hamiltonists. Historically, one may have called themselves pro-LaRouge, but LaRouge himself rejected the label of LaRougeism. American nationalism in practice means strict anti-revisionism. Therefore, America will become rather isolated from the rest of the world. There will be much focus on the development of industry and agriculture within America. Essentially, LaRougeism is the same as Hamiltonism without the revisionist trends taken by the Republican leadership. Although LaRougeism does incorporate some of the same developments that Jeffersonism does, such as more mass involvement with the political party, ultimately it sticks to Hamiltonism. Nonetheless, LaRougeism and Jeffersonists have often worked with one another or joined in the same parties. Trumpism. Another colloquial word, Trumpism, is a blanket term for supporters of the current Republican Party. This form of thinking is a revisionist yet at first alluring ideology based around the belief that Obama was the ultimate embodiment of globalism, but that Trump put a halt to this continued trend and consolidated nationalism. It has come to mean basically pan-nationalism, which can be aptly defined as if an American leader claims to be a patriot and probably isn't named Cheney, then he or she probably is. And if he or she claims to be a patriot under American nationalist guidelines, then so much the better. Trumpists generally state that Donald Trump, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon LaRouche, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Andrew Jackson, and many others were all genuine in their nationalist views, but that the latter two specifically made mistakes. They condemn LaRoucheism and Jeffersonism as sectarian, and its analysis of state capitalism as far left. Similarly, they deny the concept of European imperialism and defend the wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan in particular as fully justified, while also defending the present-day GOP as in line with the founders' values. They respond to the anti-war protests of the 1960s with disdain, supporting the government's move against the students. To the Trumpist, loyalty to the country equals loyalty to the government, no matter how opposed to the nation's best interests that government is. Trumpism is strong as a movement primarily because it allows for the acceptance of virtually all nationalist lines as acceptable and adopting an appealing call to arms toward all segments of American nationalism to unite towards revolution. In the process, however, it ignores the fact that American nationalists do call for unity, just not unity for the sake of unity. Trumpism also fails to provide for the people by establishing a Darwinist view on welfare, opposing the general line of the Founding Fathers. Rooseveltism. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected into office. Roosevelt was far from being a Lincoln disciple. As president, he shut down Hoover's protectionist tariffs. He abolished the gold standard, and he maintained our colonies in Asia, without which we never would have gone to war with the Japanese Empire. In 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt brought the United States into the Second World War on the side of the British Empire, resulting in hundreds of thousands of Americans dead. His post-war plan included the United States being exploited for its labor power by rebuilding Europe for nothing in return and creating a world government. As for Theodore Roosevelt, it is my opinion that unlike FDR, Teddy was an American nationalist that merely made mistakes, particularly his theory of American imperialism. Rooseveltism states that America must establish its own colonial empire, both to counter the European empires and to extend the American system throughout the world. This not only caused our eventual entry into the Pacific War, but also deprived nations of their right to self-determination, a key aspect of nationalism. It also inherently assumes all nations develop on the same route, which they clearly do not. Globalism is acceptable to American nationalists, but we recognize the necessity of building the American system strongly in our country first. He also supported American entry into World War I, incorrectly viewing the German Empire as a greater threat to our interests than Britain and France. Still, Theodore Roosevelt deserves commendation for his advancement of American industry, military, living standards, and the rights of women and workers. Jacksonism. Among America's presidents, there is no one who better embodies the matrix of viewpoints which allowed for the European intelligence orchestration of the Confederacy and secession than Andrew Jackson, seventh President of the United States. Included among these viewpoints can be found anti-industrialism and denunciation of manufacturing and city building as corrupting, belief in pastoral agrarianism, i.e., rural idiocy, rapid Jacobin populism, leading to an attempt to gut the Constitution's de rigist general welfare clause in so-called defense of the bigoted little people. Adherence to the British free trade doctrines of Adam Smith, and hence slavish adoption of the budget balancing dogmas of Anglo-Swiss financier agent Albert Gallatin. Support of the institution of slavery as inseparable from the Southern way of life, despite deploring individual instances of maltreatment. Racial eugenist ideas about black people. All of these viewpoints derive inherently from Jackson. Hatred of Plato and deep thoughts, and enthusiasm for the Enlightenment empiricists Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton. There is, of course, another side to Jackson, which immediately springs to mind. After all, Jackson certainly defeated the British Army in 1815. He was classically educated, and as president and after, he fostered education. And in 1833, he threatened to use military force to preserve the authority of the federal government during the nullification crisis. Nonetheless, despite his undeniable service to the nation, he caused serious harm to the development of the United States, even endangering its continued existence. Jackson's ideals were defined by his gentlemanly life as a member of the plantation class in Tennessee. Here flourished the ideals of enforced underdevelopment and of democratic equality, provided one knew one's place. Although Jackson was, to an extent, elevated and constrained by the responsibilities of office while serving as president from 1829 to 1837, for example, as when he defended the United States against the Tory secessionists of South Carolina. When he returned to private life, he reverted to those parochialist views, often referring to Tennessee as my country, and to Americans from other states as foreigners. In retirement, he stubbornly refused to grow in real knowledge or change his views, living in self-imposed isolation on his Hermitage plantation, surrounded by aristocrats, slave-holding friends, and a pro-Confederate clique. From the late 1830s onward, his populist hostility to the federal government was mixed with increasing personal bitterness as he deplored the efforts of the government, aided by the Supreme Court, to chart a nationalist course through the development of infrastructure and the chartering of manufacturing corporations. Andrew Jackson served as a mentor to future Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Moreover, Jackson's political alliances and deeds, particularly after 1829, were indispensable to the formation of the Confederacy. That Jackson had benefited from a good upbringing and classical educational advancements simply made the outcome of his life that much more tragic. Jackson's connection to the Confederacy is not a moot point, because the Jacksonian outlook is today hegemonic amongst every stripe of populist political force in the United States. It is touted by the Jackson grouping within the Democratic Party and the conservative Revolution Republicans, such as Newt Gingrich and Phil Gramm, used the same ideology to sell their evil ideas. It is indisputably the ideological underpinnings of the Ross Perot, Rush Limbaugh, and various other enraged European-steered protest movements. Listen to the Southern partisan crowd, who long nostalgically for the revival of the Confederacy. In their jargon, the defeated lost cause, which treats Jackson as a saint.